The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the pristine marble countertops of L'Etoile, but Chef Antoine Dubois barely noticed. His weathered hands moved with mechanical precision as he julienned carrots, each slice exactly 3 millimeters thick, a habit born of 40 years in professional kitchens. The knife's rhythm was hypnotic, almost meditative, but there was no peace in the motion. Each cut was a reminder of the exacting standards that had once made him great and now seemed to be strangling the life from his restaurant. The dining room beyond the kitchen's swinging doors sat nearly empty, save for an elderly couple picking at their Dover sole and a business dinner that had been rescheduled 3 times. L'Etoile, which had once commanded a 3-month waiting list, now struggled to fill even half its tables on weekend nights. The restaurant that had once buzzed with the electricity of culinary innovation now felt as sterile as a museum, its walls lined with awards that seemed to mock him with their dated glory. At 58, Antoine's salt and pepper beard framed a face that had grown increasingly stern over the years. Deep lines etched the corners of his gray eyes that had once sparkled with creative fire but now held the weary resignation of a man who had watched his dreams slowly crumble. His shoulders, once squared with confidence, now carried the weight of mounting debt, dwindling reviews, and the crushing awareness that somewhere along the way, he had lost the very thing that had made him a chef in the first place. L'Etoile had lost its 3rd Michelin star 6 months ago, a devastating blow that had been covered in food magazines across France. The reviewers' words still haunted him. Chef Dubois appears to be cooking from memory rather than inspiration, delivering technically perfect dishes that somehow lack the soul that once made L'Etoile essential dining. The critique had been surgical in its precision, cutting away at everything he thought he knew about himself. "Chef, the wine delivery is here," called Marcus, his sous chef, barely looking up from his prep work. The young man's enthusiasm had dimmed considerably since joining the kitchen 2 years ago, crushed under Antoine's increasingly rigid demands for perfection in dishes that felt more like museum pieces than living cuisine. Marcus had arrived from culinary school with dreams of innovation, but had quickly learned that deviation from Antoine's established methods was not merely discouraged, it was forbidden. Antoine nodded curtly, his mind already racing through the evening service. The same 7 entrees, the same 4 desserts, the same wine pairings he'd been serving for the past 5 years. Each dish was a monument to his former glory, executed with flawless technique, but devoid of the passion that had once driven him to experiment until dawn, searching for the perfect balance of flavors that would make diners weep with joy. The weight of his phone buzzed against his chest, interrupting his dark thoughts. A text from his publicist. "The Food Critics Gala is next week. Are you planning to participate?" It could be good publicity for L'Etoile. The younger chefs are all signing up, Bernier from Le Nouveau, Catherine from Fusion, even that molecular gastronomy chef from Barcelona. Your absence would be noted. The annual Food Critics Gala. Once, Antoine had looked forward to these events with the anticipation of a child on Christmas morning, seeing them as opportunities to showcase his latest creations, to engage in friendly competition with his peers, to push the boundaries of what French cuisine could become. Now, they felt like public executions, gladiatorial contests where younger chefs showcased their molecular gastronomy and fusion experiments while he clung to classical French techniques that the culinary world seemed to have forgotten how to appreciate. He remembered the previous year's gala, watching from the sidelines as Chef Bernier presented a deconstructed bouillabaisse that had the critics swooning. The dish had been served in a glass sphere that cracked open when touched, releasing aromatic vapor that carried the essence of the Mediterranean. It had been theatrical, innovative, and everything Antoine's cooking was not. He'd left early that night, claiming a headache, but really fleeing from the realization that he had become irrelevant in his own profession. He typed back, "Yes. I'll prepare the coq au vin with truffles." The same dish that had earned him his first Michelin star 23 years ago, when he was young and hungry and believed that perfection could be achieved through endless repetition and refinement. The dish that had once represented everything bold and innovative about his cooking had become his security blanket, his refuge from a world that no longer seemed to understand what real cooking meant. What Antoine didn't know was that his choice had been anticipated. Across the city, In a small apartment above a bakery on Rue de Martyrs, someone had been watching Latoil's decline with growing concern. Someone who remembered when Antoine Dubois had been fearless in the kitchen, when he'd spent entire nights experimenting with flavor combinations that shouldn't work but somehow did, when he'd been willing to risk everything for the chance to create something extraordinary. Someone who had loved him enough to leave when his rigidity became suffocating, and loved him enough to return when his need became desperate. The apartment was sparse but functional, containing only the essentials: a bed, a small kitchen, shelves lined with cookbooks and culinary magazines. But the walls were covered with photographs, images of Latoil in its heyday, pictures of Antoine teaching a young girl to make pasta, newspaper clippings celebrating his innovations, and awards that had once meant everything to him. In the center of it all hung a single photograph: Antoine and his daughter Sophie, both covered in flour, laughing as they worked together in the Latoil kitchen. She couldn't have been more than 16, but her face was alight with the same passion that had once driven her father. The person living in this apartment had been preparing for weeks, researching suppliers, tracking down rare ingredients, studying Antoine's routine with the dedication of a detective. Every detail had been planned, every contingency considered. This was not a casual intervention. This was a carefully orchestrated campaign to save a man from himself, to remind him of who he had been before fear and pride had built walls around his heart. The next morning, Antoine arrived at Latoil at his usual time, 5:30, well before any of his staff, to find a small package wrapped in brown paper sitting on his prep station. The morning light streaming through the kitchen windows illuminated the package like a spotlight, making it impossible to ignore. No delivery slip, no return address, no indication of where it had come from or how it had gotten past his security system. Inside, nestled in tissue paper, were 3 heirloom carrots unlike any he'd seen in his decades of cooking. They were deep purple with flecks of gold, their skin rough and earthy, their tops still vibrant green. As he lifted them from the package, their scent hit him, rich and complex, with undertones of sweetness and earth that spoke of soil and patience and time. These weren't the uniform, perfect carrots from his regular supplier. These were vegetables with personality, with character, with stories to tell. Antoine turned the carrots over in his hands, studying their irregular shapes, their imperfect beauty. They reminded him of the vegetables he'd grown up with in his grandmother's garden in Provence, before uniformity became a requirement, before perfection became the enemy of character. His grandmother had taught him that the most beautiful vegetables were often the most flavorful, that symmetry was less important than soul. "Marcus," he called when his sous chef arrived an hour later, holding up the package. "Did you order these?" The young man shook his head, already lost in his morning routine of checking inventory and preparing mise en place. "Maybe a vendor sample? You know how they are, always trying to push their specialty items. Probably cost a fortune, too." Antoine set the carrots aside, but found himself glancing at them throughout the morning. They were beautiful, certainly, but he had no use for novelty vegetables. His coq au vin required standard carrots, diced to exactly 1 centimeter cubes, nothing more, nothing less. The recipe had been perfected over decades of refinement, each ingredient measured to the gram, each technique executed with surgical precision. There was no room for experimentation, no place for the unknown. The lunch service passed without incident, though Antoine noticed that the new dishwasher, a quiet young person who'd started 3 weeks ago, moved through the kitchen with unusual grace. Most dishwashers were disasters in motion, stumbling around with their arms full of dirty plates, getting in the way of the real work. But this one seemed to anticipate the flow of the kitchen, appearing exactly where needed and disappearing just as efficiently, like a ghost who understood the rhythm of professional cooking. There was something almost supernatural about the way the dishwasher moved, sliding between stations without disrupting the workflow, always seeming to know exactly when a pan would need washing or when a station would need clearing. Antoine found himself watching from the corner of his eye, trying to understand how someone so new to the kitchen could navigate it with such confidence. "What's the dishwasher's name again?" Antoine asked Marcus during the afternoon lull, as they prepared for the evening service. "Sam, I think." "Pretty sure it's Sam. Doesn't talk much, but does good work. Never seen anyone pick up the kitchen rhythm that fast. Usually takes new people weeks to figure out where everything goes. Antoine nodded, though something nagged at him. The dishwasher's movements were too precise, too knowing. There was a familiarity in the way they handled the equipment, a confidence that spoke of more experience than a typical dish pit worker would have. But he dismissed the thought. He had more pressing concerns, like the fact that his reservation book for the following week showed only 37 covers, barely enough to cover his overhead costs. The evening service was a slow torture of half-empty tables and polite but unenthusiastic responses to his carefully crafted dishes. Antoine watched from the pass as plates came back barely touched, as servers struggled to explain why the restaurant that had once been the crown jewel of the city's dining scene now felt like a relic from another era. Each return plate was a small death, a reminder that somewhere along the way, he had lost the ability to create food that moved people. The second package arrived on Thursday, placed on his prep station with the same mysterious precision as the first. This time, it contained saffron threads so vibrant they seemed to glow in the fluorescent kitchen light, each strand perfect and aromatic, worth more per ounce than gold. Alongside the saffron was a small vial of what appeared to be aged vinegar, its dark amber color suggesting decades of patient aging. The label was written in elegant script, Vinaigre de Bordeaux, 1987. Antoine's hands trembled slightly as he held the vinegar. 1987, the year he'd opened L'Etoile, the year he'd been young and foolish enough to believe that passion alone could sustain a restaurant. The year he'd first met his wife, Marie, who had become his partner in every sense of the word before cancer had taken her too young. The year Sophie had been born, arriving in the world with the same fierce determination that would later drive her to challenge everything he believed about cooking. He uncorked the vial and inhaled, and the scent hit him like a physical blow. The vinegar was complex and layered, with notes of oak and fruit that spoke of patience and time, and the kind of meticulous care that had once defined his own approach to cooking. It was everything his own vinegar collection was not: surprising, dynamic, alive with possibility. Without thinking, he dipped his finger and tasted. The flavor exploded across his palate, rich and nuanced in ways that made his carefully curated wine cellar seem pedestrian. There were layers upon layers of flavor, each note distinct but harmonious, building to a crescendo that left him breathless. This was what complexity meant, not the artificial complexity of too many ingredients, but the natural complexity that came from time and patience and respect for the process. For a moment, he stood frozen in his kitchen, remembering what it felt like to be surprised by flavor. When had he last tasted something that made his pulse quicken? When had he last felt that electric thrill of discovery that had driven him to become a chef in the first place? The vinegar was a reminder of everything he had lost, everything he had sacrificed in his pursuit of safety and control. The moment passed as moments do, and Antoine capped the vinegar carefully, placing it in his office next to the purple carrots. Whoever was sending these gifts was wasting their time and money. He had a reputation to maintain, a gala to prepare for, and no room for the kind of experimentation that had once defined his cooking. The world had moved on from chefs like him, and he had accepted that reality, even if it meant accepting a kind of creative death. But that night, alone in his apartment above the restaurant, Antoine found himself thinking about the vinegar's complexity, about the patience required to create something so perfect, about how its maker had been willing to wait decades for the perfect flavor to emerge, had trusted in time and process, and the belief that good things came to those who were willing to wait. When had he stopped waiting? When had he stopped believing that perfection was a journey rather than a destination? The kitchen accident happened on Saturday morning, 3 days before the gala, and it felt like the final blow in a series of disasters that had been building for months. Antoine arrived at his usual time to find his sous vide machine sparking and smoking, its digital display flashing error messages before going dark entirely. The machine that had been the cornerstone of his cooking for the past 5 years, the tool that allowed him to achieve the precise temperature control essential for his style of cooking, was completely dead. "I called the repair service," Marcus said, his voice tight with the kind of stress that came from watching a carefully planned service crumble in real time. They can't get here until Monday. The earliest they could do is Tuesday if we're lucky. Antoine stared at the broken machine, feeling his carefully constructed world collapse around him. The coke oven required precise temperature control for the chicken to achieve the perfect texture, exactly 140 degrees Fahrenheit for 45 minutes, no more, no less. Without the sous vide, he'd have to use traditional braising methods, techniques he hadn't relied on in years, methods that required intuition and experience rather than digital precision. Chef. Marcus's voice seemed to come from very far away. Should I call the supplier? Maybe we can rent another machine? There's got to be something we can do. But Antoine was already moving toward the old section of the kitchen, toward equipment he'd relegated to backup status years ago. His hands reached for a heavy Dutch oven that had been his grandmother's, its cast iron surface seasoned by decades of use. The pot was older than he was, a relic from an era when cooking was about understanding fire and metal and the way heat moved through food. As he lifted the pot, its weight felt both foreign and familiar, like greeting an old friend after years of separation. This was the pot he'd learned to cook in, the one that had taught him to read the subtle signs of browning meat and reducing liquids. Before digital thermometers and precision equipment, before cooking had become a science rather than an art. He began to heat oil in the pan, and his movements slowly found their rhythm. This was how he'd learned to cook, with cast iron and instinct, before he'd become obsessed with precision and control. The oil shimmered and danced, and he found himself adjusting the heat by sound and sight rather than digital readouts, reading the subtle signs that indicated the perfect temperature for browning. The quiet dishwasher appeared at his elbow, wordlessly handing him a wooden spoon worn smooth by years of use. Their eyes met for a moment, brown eyes that seemed familiar, though Antoine couldn't place why. The dishwasher's hair was hidden under a cap, their features obscured by the kitchen's shadows and the deliberate anonymity of their uniform, but something in their expression made Antoine's breath catch. There was knowledge in those eyes, an understanding that went beyond the typical comprehension of a dish pit worker. The way they moved, the way they anticipated his needs, the way they seemed to know exactly which tool he would need next, it all spoke of someone who understood professional kitchens at a level that went far beyond washing dishes. "Thank you," he said softly, but the dishwasher had already melted back into the kitchen's controlled chaos, disappearing between the stations with the same ghostly efficiency that had marked their presence from the beginning. As the day wore on, Antoine found himself falling into a rhythm he'd forgotten existed. Without the precise control of his modern equipment, he had to rely on his senses, on the intuition that had made him a chef in the first place. The coke oven began to take shape in ways that felt both familiar and foreign, each step a rediscovery of techniques he'd thought he'd outgrown. The chicken browned in the Dutch oven with a sizzle that spoke of proper heat and timing. The vegetables, including, almost without thinking, some of the mysterious purple carrots, added their own layers of flavor to the building dish. And then, in a moment of inspiration that felt like muscle memory, he added a pinch of those mysterious saffron threads and a careful splash of the aged vinegar. The transformation was immediate and dramatic. The dish that had been merely technically perfect suddenly became something alive, something that sang with complexity and depth. The purple carrots added an earthy sweetness that complemented the wine perfectly, while the saffron provided a floral note that lifted the entire dish. And the vinegar, that miraculous vinegar, added a brightness that tied everything together in ways that made Antoine's carefully calculated recipe seem pedestrian by comparison. For the first time in years, Antoine found himself tasting his food with genuine curiosity rather than mere quality control. The coke oven was still recognizably the dish that had made his reputation, but it was also something new, something that honored tradition while embracing possibility. It was what his cooking had been before fear had made him rigid, before the pursuit of perfection had become the enemy of creativity. Sunday brought the final package, and this time, Antoine's hands shook as he opened it. Inside was a single sheet of paper, yellowed with age, covered in handwriting he recognized but couldn't quite place. The script was flowing and confident, speaking of youth and enthusiasm and the kind of fearless creativity that had once defined his own approach to cooking. The paper was a recipe, written in a style that was both familiar and strange. Papa's Coke oven with a twist, try adding a touch of lavender honey and fresh thyme at the end. The sweetness balances the wine's acidity, and the thyme adds an earthiness that makes the dish sing. Don't be afraid to trust your instincts. They're better than any recipe book. The best cooking comes from the heart, not from measurements. Love S. Antoine's legs gave out, and he sank onto a prep stool, the paper trembling in his hands like a leaf in a storm.
Sophie.
His daughter, his brilliant, stubborn, impossible daughter who had left Latoile 3 years ago after their final, devastating argument. The daughter who had inherited his passion for cooking but had wanted to take it in directions he couldn't understand, couldn't accept. The fight had been building for months, a slow-burning conflict between his desire to preserve tradition and her need to innovate. Sophie had wanted to modernize the menu, to add her own creative touches to the classics, to bring Latoile into the 21st century. She'd proposed dishes that combined French techniques with international influences, presentations that were both beautiful and theatrical, flavor combinations that honored the past while embracing the future. He'd refused everything. He'd called her additions gimmicks, her innovations disrespectful to tradition. He'd accused her of trying to turn Latoile into just another trendy restaurant, of abandoning everything he'd worked to build. The argument had escalated until they were screaming at each other in the kitchen, years of frustration and misunderstanding boiling over into words that couldn't be taken back. She'd left that night, her final words echoing in his memory like a curse. "You've forgotten that cooking is supposed to be about love, Papa. You've turned it into a prison, and you're the only one with the key." He'd been too proud to call her, too stubborn to admit that maybe, just maybe, she'd been right. Too afraid that reaching out would mean admitting that everything he'd built was crumbling, that his rigid adherence to tradition had become the very thing that was destroying his legacy. And now, 3 years later, he held her handwriting in his shaking hands and realized that all the mysterious packages, all the strange coincidences, all the subtle interventions had been her. The purple carrots, the aged vinegar, the saffron threads, they were all love letters disguised as ingredients, attempts to remind him of who he'd been before fear had made him forget. The realization hit him like a physical blow. Sophie had been there all along, watching him struggle, watching his restaurant die, watching him lose himself in his pursuit of an impossible perfection. She'd been the quiet dishwasher, the anonymous benefactor, the invisible hand guiding him back toward the chef he'd once been. The gala was held at the Grand Palais, its soaring glass ceiling reflecting the light of 100 chandeliers. The venue was magnificent, transformed for the evening into a showcase of culinary artistry where the city's most celebrated chefs would compete for the critics' attention and approval. Antoine stood at his assigned station, his Coke oven keeping warm and elegant serving dishes, watching as food critics and culinary influencers made their rounds like judges in a gladiatorial arena. The competing chefs had truly outdone themselves this year. Chef Bernier from Le Nouveau had created what he called the Ocean's Memory, a series of molecular spheres that burst with the concentrated essence of different seas, each one a perfect recreation of oceanic environments in miniature. Catherine from Fusion had presented a dish that existed in 4 dimensions, using dry ice and projection mapping to create flavors that seemed to float in the air before landing on the diner's palate. The molecular gastronomy chef from Barcelona had gone even further, creating what he called the death and rebirth of bouillabaisse, a dish that began as a traditional French soup but transformed through temperature and chemical reactions into something that looked like abstract art and tasted like the future of cooking. Antoine's own dish looked simple by comparison, almost primitive in its straightforward presentation. The rich, dark sauce gleamed under the lights, fragrant with wine and herbs, the chicken tender enough to cut with a fork. The purple carrots added unexpected color and sweetness, while the subtle floral notes from the saffron created layers of complexity that revealed themselves slowly, like a symphony building to crescendo. It was everything he'd intended it to be, a perfect execution of a classic technique, elevated by ingredients that spoke of patience and care and the kind of deep understanding that could only come from decades of experience. But it was also something more, something that honored tradition while embracing the possibility of change. So why did he feel so hollow standing there, watching the critics sample dishes that pushed the boundaries of what food could be? Why did he feel like he was attending his own funeral, presenting a dish that represented everything he'd been rather than everything he could become? The head critic, Catherine Moreau, approached his station with her trademark serious expression. She was younger than him by a decade, but her reputation for brutal honesty had made her the most feared voice in French cuisine. Her reviews could make or break careers, and her approval was the difference between relevance and obsolescence in the culinary world. Antoine had once courted her approval desperately, sending her endless invitations to L'Etoile, hoping for a review that would restore his reputation. Now, he simply hoped to avoid her disdain, to present his dish with enough dignity to avoid complete humiliation. "Chef Dubois," she said, accepting a plate with the professional smile she gave everyone. The classic approach. Bold choice in an evening of such innovation. Antoine watched as she took her first bite, her expression neutral and professional. He'd seen that look 1,000 times, the careful consideration of someone whose opinion could determine the fate of restaurants and careers. She chewed thoughtfully, her face revealing nothing of her thoughts or impressions. But then something shifted. Her eyebrows rose slightly, and she took a second bite, more thoughtful this time. There was a subtle change in her posture, a leaning forward that suggested genuine interest rather than mere professional obligation. "This is..." She paused, searching for words that seemed to elude her. "This is extraordinary. The depth of flavor, the complexity, it's your classic technique, but there's something else. Something that makes it feel alive." She leaned closer, lowering her voice to a whisper that only he could hear. "Chef, this tastes like it was made with love. There's a subtle daring here I haven't tasted from you in years. It reminds me of the fire of a young chef I once knew, and dare I say, a certain pastry chef's innovative spirit." Antoine's heart stopped. The words hit him like a physical blow, not because they were critical, but because they were true. The dish did taste different, not just technically perfect, but emotionally resonant in ways that his cooking hadn't been for years. It tasted like the food he'd made when cooking was still an adventure, when every dish was an opportunity to tell a story. Before he could respond, he heard a familiar voice behind him, soft but clear in the acoustics of the great hall. He always was better when he trusted his instincts. Antoine turned, and there she was. Sophie stepped out from behind the serving station. No longer in the dishwasher's uniform he now realized she'd been wearing for weeks. Instead, she wore a simple white chef's jacket, crisp and professional, her dark hair pulled back in the same ponytail she'd worn as a child when she'd stood on milk crates to reach the prep tables. Her brown eyes, his eyes, were bright with unshed tears and something that might have been hope. "Sophie," he whispered, her name a prayer on his lips, a word he'd wanted to say for 3 years but had never found the courage to speak. "Hello, Papa." She moved closer, her hands clasped in front of her in a gesture that was both nervous and determined. "I've been watching you, hoping you'd remember who you used to be. The chef who taught me that cooking wasn't just about following recipes, it was about putting your heart on the plate and trusting people to taste your soul." The kitchen around them seemed to fade away as Antoine stared at his daughter, taking in the changes that 3 years had wrought. She was older, more confident, but still unmistakably his little girl, the one who had learned to make pasta by standing on a step stool beside him, who had inherited his passion for cooking along with his stubborn determination to do things her own way. "The packages," he said, his voice barely audible above the sounds of the gala. "The equipment failure. The carrots, the vinegar, the saffron. You." "I couldn't watch you give up," Sophie interrupted, her voice thick with emotion. "L'Etoile was dying, Papa, and you were dying with it. You'd forgotten that cooking is supposed to be joyful, supposed to be about sharing love with every dish you create. You turned it into a museum to your own past instead of a living, breathing expression of who you are." Antoine reached out with trembling hands, touching her face as if she might disappear like a mirage. Her skin was warm and real, solid proof that this wasn't a dream, that his daughter had really come back to him. "I thought I'd lost you forever," he whispered. I thought my pride had cost me the only thing that mattered more than the restaurant. I thought. You never lost me, Sophie said, covering his hand with her own. I was just waiting for you to remember that tradition and innovation aren't enemies. They're dance partners, and the best cooking happens when they move together in perfect harmony. Around them, the gala continued, critics and chefs engaged in the eternal dance of culinary competition. But Antoine was aware only of his daughter's presence, of the way she'd risked everything to save him from his own stubbornness. The critics were tasting his dish, the dish that had been transformed by her secret additions, by her love disguised as anonymous gifts. The lavender honey, he said suddenly, the final piece of the puzzle falling into place. I can taste it now, the way it balances the wine's acidity. It's perfect. Sophie smiled, the expression lighting up her entire face like sunrise after a long night. I knew you'd figure it out. You always were the best chef I knew, Papa. You just forgot to trust yourself, forgot that the best recipes aren't written in books. They're written in the heart. Catherine Moreau cleared her throat behind them, her professional composure cracking slightly as she witnessed the reunion unfolding before her. Chef Dubois, I believe congratulations are in order. This dish, it's not just technically perfect, it's emotionally resonant. It tells a story, and that story is what great cooking is all about. Antoine looked at his daughter, at the woman who had risked her pride and her privacy to save him from himself. It tells the story of a father who almost lost everything because he was too afraid to change, and of a daughter who loved him enough to show him the way back to himself. The weeks that followed were a whirlwind of reconciliation and renewal. Latoile's reservation book filled as word spread about the mysterious story behind the gala dish, but more importantly, Antoine found himself cooking with joy again, working alongside Sophie to create a menu that honored tradition while embracing innovation. They spent long hours in the kitchen, father and daughter, relearning each other's rhythms and rediscovering the partnership that had once made them both better cooks. Sophie introduced him to techniques he'd dismissed as gimmicks, showing him how a touch of molecular gastronomy could enhance rather than replace classical preparations. Antoine taught her the patience required for perfect sauces, the way time and temperature could transform simple ingredients into something transcendent. The day La Toile received its third Michelin star back, Antoine found Sophie in the kitchen before dawn, preparing for the lunch service. She looked up as he entered, her face bright with the exhaustion and exhilaration that came from creating something beautiful. No regrets? He asked, as he had every morning for the past month. None, she replied, as she had every morning for the past month. This is where I belong, Papa. Where we belong. Antoine nodded, pulling on his chef's jacket, the same one he'd worn for 20 years, but somehow it felt different now. Lighter, as if the weight of his mistakes had been lifted, replaced by the promise of new possibilities. The lunch service was perfect, each dish a testament to their partnership. As Antoine watched Sophie plate her dessert, a deconstructed tarte tatin that honored the classic while adding her own innovative touches, he realized that this was what he'd been missing all along. Not just the technical perfection he'd pursued so relentlessly, but the joy of sharing his passion with someone who understood it as deeply as he did. The secret ingredient had never been a spice or a technique or a piece of equipment. It had been love, disguised as purple carrots and aged vinegar, as broken equipment and anonymous notes. It had been his daughter's faith in him, her willingness to sacrifice her pride to save his soul, her understanding that sometimes the people we love most need to be reminded of who they really are. And now, as they worked side by side in the kitchen that had once felt like a prison, Antoine understood that the best recipes weren't written in books or learned in culinary school. They were written in the heart, passed down through generations of cooks who understood that food was just the beginning. The real magic happened when you put love on the plate and invited someone to taste it, when you trusted them enough to share not just your technique, but your soul. La Toile lived again, not as a museum to past glories, but as a living testament to the power of family, forgiveness, and the courage to begin again. And in the kitchen, surrounded by the sounds and smells of a working restaurant, Antoine Dubois cooked not just with his hands, but with his heart, finally understanding that the secret ingredient had been there all along, waiting patiently for him to remember how to use it.